June 12, 1942. The Mius River crossing, Southern Front. Lieutenant Nadezhda Popova cut her engine at precisely 300 meters from the target. The Polikapov Pototu biplane fell silent except for the whisper of wind through canvas wings. The sudden quiet was absolute, total. They had no idea death was gliding toward them from above. Popova's hands were steady on the controls. 20 years old, a student just months before. Now she was invisible, a ghost riding the night wind toward an enemy that could not see her coming. Her navigator, crouched in the rear cockpit with a map and stopwatch, counted seconds, calculated wind speed, estimated drift. She tapped Popova's shoulder once. The signal. Popova pulled the bomb release. 2 bombs, 350 kilograms total. The wooden biplane lurched upward, suddenly lighter, and Popova fought to keep the nose level. Then she throttled the engine back to life. The Shvetsov M11 radial coughed once, twice, then roared. She banked hard into the night sky. Behind her, the bridge erupted in flame, orange light painting the darkness. Then she was gone. The Germans called it the sound of a witch's broomstick, that eerie whistling in the darkness. No engine roar, no warning, just wind rushing through wooden struts and canvas, and then the world exploding. Some nights they heard it a dozen times, some nights more. The sound that meant bombs were falling, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. They would come to fear that sound more than anything else on the Eastern Front. The women who made it were barely out of their teens. Most had never fired a weapon before 1941. They flew training aircraft made of plywood and fabric, planes designed for teaching student pilots and dusting crops, not waging war. They had no parachutes, no radios, no guns. They carried only maps, compasses, stopwatches, and pencils. They flew so many missions each night that ground crews could barely keep up, loading bombs by hand in the darkness, racing against time to get the aircraft back in the air. And they terrorized the most powerful air force in the world, described the sound, the waiting, the helplessness. You could hear the engine approaching, a faint buzz in the distance, then silence, absolute silence. And in that silence you knew the bombs were already falling, you just did not know where. Some men would throw themselves flat at the first sound of an engine. Others would fire blindly into the darkness, their muzzle flashes giving away their positions. Nothing worked. The bombs fell anyway, every single night. This is the story of the 588th Night Bomber Aviation Regiment. History would remember them by the name the Germans gave them, the Night Witches. The invasion came on June 22, 1941, Operation Barbarossa. 3 million German troops crashed across the Soviet border in the largest military operation in human history. 3,000 tanks, 7,000 artillery pieces, 2,000 aircraft. The entire force of the Wehrmacht concentrated on a single objective, the destruction of the Soviet Union. Within weeks, entire Soviet armies ceased to exist. The Germans advanced 50 miles a day, 100 miles. The Red Army had more tanks than Germany, more artillery, more men. None of it mattered. Soviet forces were caught unprepared, poorly positioned, commanded by officers who had survived Stalin's purges precisely because they had never questioned orders. Close enough that German officers could see the spires of the Kremlin through field glasses. Leningrad was under siege. 3 million Soviet soldiers were prisoners. The Air Force was shattered. Most Soviet aircraft had been destroyed on the ground in the first 48 hours of the invasion, caught on runways, parked in neat rows. German fighters and bombers had simply flown over and obliterated them before Soviet pilots could even reach their planes. The survivors flew obsolete aircraft against the most modern air force in the world. They died in staggering numbers. The Soviet Union was bleeding out. Cities were burning. Millions were dead. Millions more were starving. The industrial heartland was being overrun. The Germans were taking everything, the factories, the oil fields, the farmland. Without those resources, the Soviet Union could not continue the war. Everyone knew it. Stalin knew it. The generals knew it. And still the Germans advanced. Marina Raskova saw the disaster unfolding and knew what had to be done. She was already famous. The Soviet Amelia Earhart, they called her. The first female navigator in the Soviet Air Force, holder of multiple long-distance flight records. In 1938, she had navigated a record-breaking flight from Moscow to the Far East, over 6,000 kilometers in 26 hours. When the aircraft ran low on fuel, She had parachuted out to reduce weight so her crewmates could land safely. She survived 10 days in the Siberian wilderness before being rescued, a hero of the Soviet Union at age 28. Young women from across the Soviet Union, pilots and mechanics and engineers, all asking the same question: how can we fight? These were not naive girls looking for adventure. Many were experienced pilots. The Soviet Union had encouraged aviation clubs throughout the 1930s. The Ossoaviakim Society for Cooperation in Defense and Aviation Chemical Development had trained tens of thousands of civilians to fly, women and men both. There was no discrimination in the air clubs. If you could fly, you could fly. Simple as that. Some of these women had logged more flight hours than the men being rushed to the front. They knew engines, knew navigation, knew how to handle an aircraft in bad weather, in emergencies, in situations where one mistake meant death. They had skills the Soviet Union desperately needed, and they were being told to stay home, to work in factories, to grow food, important work certainly. But not what they had trained for, not what they knew they could do. Soviet military doctrine had no answer for this. Women could serve in support roles. They could be nurses, radio operators, cooks. They could work in factories building aircraft that men would fly. But combat pilots? The idea was absurd. Military commanders rejected it outright. One recruiting officer reportedly told women applicants to go home and help their mothers. The Soviet Union was facing annihilation, and they were turning away trained pilots because of their gender. Raskova went over their heads. She had something few others possessed: direct access to Joseph Stalin. She had earned it. Her long-distance flight records had made her a propaganda asset for the Soviet state. Stalin himself had attended the celebrations when she returned from her record-breaking flights. She used that access now. She argued that the Soviet Union needed every pilot it could get, that gender was irrelevant when your country was being destroyed, that these women were trained, willing, and capable, that turning them away was a waste of resources the Soviet Union could not afford. Stalin listened. On October 8, 1941, he signed Order No. 0A99. 3 all-female aviation regiments would be formed: the 506th Fighter Aviation Regiment, the 507th Bomber Aviation Regiment, and the 588th Night Bomber Aviation Regiment. Every position would be filled by women: pilots, navigators, mechanics, armorers, ground crews, administrative staff, everything. It was unprecedented. No other nation in the war would field all-female combat aviation units. Not Britain, not America, not Germany. Only the Soviet Union, driven by desperation and pragmatism, would give women this opportunity. The response was overwhelming. They came from factories where they had been building aircraft. They came from flying clubs where they had been teaching others to fly. Some were teenagers, some were in their mid-20s, all were volunteers, all understood that they were probably going to die. Raskova selected 400 for each regiment. The selection process was brutal: physical endurance tests, flight examinations, navigation assessments, medical evaluations. Only the best were accepted. Even then, many would not survive training. They reported to Engels, a small town north of Stalingrad on the Volga River, in October 1941. The temperature was already dropping. Winter was coming. They had months to learn what normally took years. The training was brutal. They studied navigation, aerodynamics, bombing techniques, aircraft maintenance. They learned to fly by compass and stopwatch in total darkness. They practiced emergency landings with engines cut. They memorized the locations of every German defensive position within range. They worked 18-hour days, then 20-hour days. There was no time for anything else. Every day of training was another day. The Germans advanced. The pilots with the most experience went to the 586th Fighter Regiment. They would fly Yakovlev Yak-1 fighters, brand new aircraft. The second tier went to the 587th Bomber Regiment. They would fly Petlyakov P-2 dive bombers, twin engines, modern, fast. The least experienced pilots were assigned to the 588th. They would fly what nobody else wanted: the Polikarpov Po-2, a training biplane from 1928. Wooden frame, canvas skin, no instruments beyond basic gauges. Top speed of 94 miles per hour when fully loaded. Maximum bomb load of 770 pounds. 2 bombs per mission. That was it. The plane had been designed for teaching student pilots, for crop dusting, not for war. It had an open cockpit, no heat, no armor. The fuel tank sat directly behind the pilot's head. One tracer round and the whole thing would go up like a torch. The women of the 588th looked at their aircraft and understood what they were being given. Garbage. Hand-me-downs, the planes nobody else would touch. They were given oversized men's uniforms that hung loose on their frames. Boots so large they had to stuff them with newspaper and rags. Equipment that was worn out before they even received it. The message was clear. You want to fight? Fine. But we're not wasting good equipment on you. Major Yevdokia Bershanskaya took command of the regiment. She was 30 years old, calm, methodical, unflappable. She would lead them through the entire war without ever being replaced. That alone made the 58th unique. The other two women's regiments would eventually get male commanders. Not the 58th. Bershanskaya would prove that women needed no one's permission to lead. They deployed to the southern front in May 1942. The journey took days. The aircraft flew in formation, low, slow, vulnerable to any German fighter that spotted them. They landed at temporary airfields, dirt strips carved from farmland, no concrete, no permanent structures, just open ground and a few tents. The war had been raging for almost a year, an entire year of German advances, an entire year of Soviet defeats. The Germans controlled vast swaths of Soviet territory from the Baltic to the Black Sea. They were pushing toward the Caucasus oil fields, toward Stalingrad, toward the Volga River. If they took the oil, the Soviet war machine would grind to a halt. If they took Stalingrad, they would control the river transport that kept Soviet armies supplied. The strategic situation was desperate. The 588th was assigned to the 218th Night Bomber Division of the 4th Air Army. Their commander briefed them on their first day at the front. The mission was simple. Fly at night, drop bombs on German positions, disrupt their operations, keep them from sleeping, break their morale, do whatever damage you can with what little you have. That was it. No grand strategy, no complex objectives, just harassment, just terror, just making the Germans afraid to close their eyes. The male pilots at the base looked at the women and their Po-2 biplanes with something between pity and contempt. These were combat veterans. Men who had flown against the Luftwaffe and survived. Men who had watched friends die. They flew modern aircraft. Fighters. Bombers with actual defenses. Some of the men made jokes. Some made cruder comments. Most just ignored them. The women said nothing. They unpacked their equipment, set up their tents, prepared their aircraft for combat operations. They had nothing to prove to anyone. They had been given a mission. They would complete it. The opinions of men who had never flown at night in an open cockpit meant nothing. The regiment's first combat mission launched on June 12, 1942. 3 aircraft, each with a pilot and navigator, each carrying 2 bombs. Their target was German positions along the Mius River, river crossings, supply roads, anything that would slow the German advance. The planes took off just after dark. The sun had set an hour before. The sky was black, no moon, perfect conditions. Popova flew the lead aircraft. Behind her, 2 other crews followed. They maintained tight formation, no lights, no radio, just visual contact and trust. If you lost sight of the lead aircraft, you were on your own. They flew low, very low, sometimes just meters above the ground. Navigation was done by map and stopwatch. They had memorized the route, every landmark, every turn. The Mius River ran north to south. The German positions were on the western bank. Approach from the east, drop bombs, turn south, escape at low altitude, simple on paper, terrifying in practice. 15 minutes into the flight, they saw the first German positions, work lights, portable generators. They needed that bridge, needed it to move supplies forward, to bring reinforcements to the front, to maintain their offensive momentum. They worked under lights because they needed to finish before dawn. The lights made them visible for miles. Popova cut her engine at 300 meters. The other aircraft followed her lead. The Germans heard nothing, saw nothing. They kept working, driving pilings, securing pontoons, stringing cable. The work lights illuminated everything perfectly. Popova's navigator tapped her shoulder, bombs away. 2 bombs dropped from beneath the lower wings. The other 2 aircraft released their bombs seconds later. 6 bombs total, falling toward the bridge in the darkness. Then Popova restarted her engine. The sudden roar was deafening after the silence. She banked hard. The other aircraft scattered. 3 different directions. Standard doctrine: never give the enemy a single target. The bombs hit. Orange fireballs erupted along the riverbank. The pontoon bridge convulsed. Sections broke loose. Men were thrown into the water. Others ran for cover. Secondary explosions as stored supplies caught fire. A fuel dump, ammunition, something flammable. The flames climbed into the night sky, visible for kilometers. German anti-aircraft guns opened fire. Tracer rounds arced through the darkness. The gunners were firing blind. They had no target, just shooting at where they thought the aircraft might be. The tracers were beautiful and lethal, strings of fire reaching into the sky. The night witches were already gone, racing south at treetop level, invisible in the darkness. Behind them, the bridge burned. They returned to base 20 minutes later, landed, taxied to the revetment, shut down engines, climbed out of their cockpits. The other 2 crews were already there. Everyone had made it back. The mission was successful. The bridge was damaged. German operations were disrupted. And the night was still young. They had hours until dawn. Time for more missions. The ground crews swarmed the aircraft, refueling, rearming, checking for damage, working by the light of hooded lanterns. No bright lights. Lights would make them targets for German bombers. Everything done in near darkness by feel and experience. 200 liters of fuel per aircraft, 2 bombs per aircraft. Check the engine, check the control surfaces, check everything. 20 minutes, that was the goal. Get the aircraft ready in 20 minutes so the crews could fly again. Popova stood by her aircraft and watched the ground crew work. She was shaking. Not from fear, from adrenaline, from the cold, from the realization of what they had just done. They had bombed a German position, actually bombed it, not in training, not in simulation, for real. With real bombs and real Germans and real anti-aircraft fire. And they had done it in wooden biplanes that should never have been used for combat, and it had worked. Bershanskaya, the regimental commander, approached. Her face was calm. She had not flown on this first mission. She had stayed at the base, monitored progress, made decisions. That was her role, command. "Good work," she said. "Rest for 10 minutes, then we go again." They flew again, and again, and again, 3 times that first night. 9 aircraft total on 3 separate strikes, different targets each time. An ammunition depot, a supply convoy, German troops bivouacked in an orchard. By the time dawn approached and they had to cease operations, they had flown 9 sorties and dropped 18 bombs. 18 bombs that weighed less than 800 pounds each, not even 7,000 pounds of ordnance total. A heavy bomber could drop twice that in a single mission, but the damage was disproportionate to the tonnage. The Germans had lost a bridge, lost supplies, lost sleep, lost men. Most importantly, they had lost their sense of security. They had thought the night belonged to them. That Soviet aircraft could not operate in darkness, that their defensive positions were safe once the sun went down. The night witches had proven them wrong, and this was only the first night. 1 plane was lost that first night, shot down over the target. The crew did not return. Their names were Polina Dmitrievna Makogon, pilot, and Marina Borisovna Smimova, navigator, both 21 years old, the first casualties of the 5-arst 88th Night Bomber Regiment. They would not be the last. But the mission was successful. The bombs hit their marks. The Germans were burning, and the night bombers would be back tomorrow, and the night after that, and every night until the war ended. The Po-2 should have been a death trap. By every measure it was obsolete, slower than World War I fighters, made of materials that belonged in a barn, not a war zone. But the women of the 508th discovered something the engineers had never anticipated. The plane's weaknesses were also its strengths. The Po-2 had a maximum speed of 94 miles per hour when carrying bombs. The Messerschmitt Bf 109, Germany's frontline fighter, had a stall speed of 120 miles per hour. Think about that. The Soviet biplane's top speed was lower than the speed at which the German fighter would fall out of the sky. A Bf 109 pilot trying to engage a Po-2 faced an impossible problem. If he slowed down enough to match the Soviet plane's speed, his own aircraft would stall. He would drop out of the sky before he could line up a shot. The Focke-Wulf W1NT had the same problem. These were the most advanced fighters in the world, and they could not engage a wooden biplane without killing themselves in the process. The Po-2 could turn on a coin. The German pilot would try to follow and discover his aircraft could not hold the turn at such low speed. He would have to pull out, gain altitude, come around for another pass. Yo-02 would be somewhere else entirely, or hugging the ground so close that tracer fire from other German positions was as likely to hit the fighter as the biplane. German pilots would make pass after pass, burning fuel and ammunition, never getting a clean shot. Eventually they would give up and leave. The slow wooden planes were untouchable. The Po-2 had another advantage nobody expected. It was made of wood and canvas. German radar of the era worked by bouncing radio waves off metal surfaces. The Po-2 had almost no metal in its structure. It barely registered on radar screens. The small engine produced minimal heat. Infrared detectors, which tracked the heat signatures of aircraft engines, often could not pick up a Po-2 at all. The planes were invisible to the technology of the age. Radio direction finding equipment was useless because the Night Witches never used radios. They navigated by sight and dead reckoning. The Germans had built a sophisticated air defense network based on modern technology. The Night Witches defeated it by flying museum pieces. But the real genius was in the tactics. The attack technique was simple and terrifying. A pilot would approach the target at low altitude with the engine running, maybe 50 feet off the ground, sometimes lower. Low enough that German soldiers could hear the engine but could not see the aircraft in the darkness. Then, a few hundred meters from the target, the pilot would cut the engine, the plane would go silent, it would glide. The only sound was wind rushing through the wing struts and control wires, a soft whooshing noise, like a broom sweeping through the air. The Germans would hear it and know what was coming, but they could not see it, could not stop it. The navigator would calculate the release point, tap the pilot's shoulder, the bombs would fall. Then the pilot would restart the engine and bank away into the night. By the time the bombs exploded, the Po-2 was already gone. The German soldiers called it the sound of witches, Nachthexen, night witches. They meant it as an insult. The women of the 50/80th adopted it with pride. They painted flowers on the sides of their aircraft. They used navigational pencils as lipstick. They were told they could not fight because they were women, so they would fight as women, and they would make the Germans wish they had never heard that sound in the darkness. The planes could only carry 2 bombs, 350 kilograms total, less than 800 pounds. For comparison, a British Lancaster bomber could carry 14,000 pounds. An American B-17 could carry 8,000. The Po-2 carried less than 1/10 of what the heavy bombers dropped. But weight was not the point. The point was that the bombs kept coming, night after night after night, no rest, no reprieve. The Germans could shoot down a heavy bomber and know they had stopped thousands of pounds of ordnance. They could hit a Po-2 and 20 minutes later another one would appear, and another after that. 8 missions per night was common, 10, 12. On record-breaking nights, pilots flew 15 or 18 missions. Nadezhda Popova and Yekaterina Ryabova once flew 18 sorties in a single night. 18 times they took off, flew to the target, dropped bombs, returned, reloaded, and went back. That is not warfare. That is systematic industrial terror. The ground crews worked miracles. They had to. Each aircraft had to be refueled and rearmed between missions. That meant hauling bombs through the darkness, manhandling them under the lower wings, securing them to makeshift racks, checking the release mechanisms by hand, pouring fuel into tanks. All while German artillery might start falling at any moment. All while the pilots were already climbing back into their cockpits. The mechanics worked through the night without stopping. When morning came and the last planes returned, they would service the aircraft, repair battle damage, catch maybe an hour or 2 of sleep, and start again the next evening. If a plane was too badly damaged to fly, they would cannibalize parts from other aircraft. Nothing was wasted, nothing was left behind. The conditions were inhuman. In winter, temperatures on the open steppes dropped to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. The Po-2 had an open cockpit, no windscreen, no protection from the wind. Pilots and navigators flew in temperatures cold enough to cause frostbite in minutes. They wore every piece of clothing they had. It was not enough. The cold was so severe that touching the metal parts of the aircraft with bare skin meant leaving flesh behind. The controls would freeze. The bomb release mechanisms would jam. When that happened, the navigator would have to climb out onto the wing while the aircraft was in flight and kick the bombs free. Yes. climb out of the cockpit at night in freezing temperatures while flying over enemy territory, and physically kick bombs loose with their boots. That happened, repeatedly. In summer, the heat was nearly as bad. The southern front in July could reach over 100 degrees. The pilots wore thick leather flight suits because the slipstream at 90 miles per hour was cold even in summer. They would roast on the ground, freeze in the air, land dripping with sweat, and take off again. Dehydration was constant. Exhaustion was a given. They flew anyway. The Germans adapted. The night witches were making it impossible to operate. Supply depots were burning. Fuel dumps were exploding. German soldiers could not sleep. The psychological impact was as damaging as the physical destruction. Every time a man closed his eyes, he heard that sound. The whisper of wind through canvas, then the explosion, then screaming, night after night. Morale collapsed. Units that had been considered elite became jumpy and exhausted. The Germans called in their night fighters. They reinforced their anti-aircraft defenses. They deployed searchlight batteries. They created what the Soviets called a flak circus. The flak circus was sophisticated. The Germans would ring high-value targets with concentric circles of searchlights and anti-aircraft guns, sometimes 24 searchlights, dozens of flak positions. The lights would be concealed during the day. At night they would activate. When a Soviet aircraft approached, the searchlights would lock onto it. The plane would be illuminated from every angle, blinded, exposed. Then every gun within range would open fire. Po-2 biplanes caught in a flak circus were shredded. The canvas skin offered no protection. Flak would punch through the wings, the fuselage, the crew. In those first few weeks, losses mounted. Planes did not return. New crews took their place. They did not return either. The night witches developed counter-tactics. They flew in formations of 3. 2 aircraft would approach the searchlight ring and deliberately attract attention. The lights would lock onto them. The flak would open up. The 2 decoy aircraft would break in opposite directions, flying wildly, jinxing and turning to avoid the fire. The searchlight operators would follow them. And while every eye was on the decoys, the 3rd aircraft would fly through the darkness above the target and drop its bombs unopposed. Then they would rotate. The 3rd aircraft would become a decoy for the next run. It required absolute trust. The decoys were flying into the guns on purpose, drawing fire so their sisters could complete the mission. It worked, but it meant that 1/3 of every formation was deliberately putting themselves in the line of fire on every attack. Shooting down a night witch became an obsession for the Luftwaffe. The German High Command reportedly offered an automatic Iron Cross to any pilot who could bring one down. The Iron Cross for killing a single Soviet pilot flying a training biplane. That tells you everything about how much the Germans feared them. Luftwaffe asses who had dozens of kills to their names could not hit the Po-2s. The planes were too slow, too maneuverable, too close to the ground. German soldiers began to spread rumors. They could see in total darkness. That was why they never used lights. That was why they never missed. The truth was simpler and more impressive. The women were just that good. There was one exception, Luftwaffe fighter ace Joseph Kościuk. On the night of July 31, 1943, Kościuk shot down 4 night witches. Some accounts say 3. Either way, it was a catastrophe. The regiment was grounded until they could assess what had happened. How had one German pilot done what entire fighter groups could not? The answer was patience. Kościuk had not tried to dogfight the biplanes. He had not tried to chase them at low altitude. He had climbed high above the battlefield and waited for the night witches to complete their bomb runs and climb for altitude to return to base. That was when they were vulnerable. That was when they were flying straight and level, gaining height, exposed. Kościuk had dived on them from above with all the speed his aircraft could muster. He had not tried to engage in a turning fight. He had made slashing attacks, hit and run. One pass and gone. The night witches learned from this. They never climbed to altitude over enemy territory again. They stayed low until they were well away from German positions. Kościuk's technique worked once, never again. By February 1943, the regiment had proven itself. They were reorganized and given the Guards designation. They became the 46th Guards Night Bomber Aviation Regiment. In October 1943, after their involvement in the liberation of the Taman Peninsula, they became the 46th Taman Guards Night Bomber Aviation Regiment. Guard status was the highest honor the Soviet military could bestow on a unit. It meant they were elite, the best. And they were. By every measure they were. The missions continued. Every night, they supported the defense of the Caucasus. They flew in the battle for Stalingrad. They participated in the liberation of the Crimea. They were at the Kerch-Eltigan landing. They supported operations in Belarus. The Red Army advanced. The Night Witches flew ahead, hitting German positions, destroying supplies, keeping the enemy awake and terrified. They lobbed over 23,000 combat sorties. They dropped over 3,000 tons of bombs and 26,000 incendiary shells. They destroyed or damaged 17 river crossings, 9 railways, 2 railway stations, 26 warehouses, 12 fuel depots, 176 armored vehicles, 86 prepared firing positions, and 11 searchlights. They also flew 155 supply missions, dropping food and ammunition to Soviet troops surrounded behind German lines. The human cost was devastating. 32 members of the regiment were killed in action over the course of the war, 32 young women who had volunteered to defend their country and paid with their lives. Some were shot down by flak, some by night fighters, some crashed in bad weather or mechanical failures, some died when their aircraft caught fire and they had no parachutes to escape with. The regiment did not have parachutes until 1944. The weight was needed for bombs. 7 or 8 kilograms for a parachute, 7 or 8 kilograms that could be used for explosives instead. So for the first 2 years of combat, every pilot and navigator knew that if their aircraft was hit and caught fire, they were going to burn. There was no way out. They flew anyway. Think about that for a moment. Think about climbing into a wooden aircraft covered in fabric, an aircraft that burns like paper if hit by a tracer round. An aircraft where the fuel tank sits directly behind your head. An aircraft with no armor, no protection, nothing between you and enemy fire except thin canvas and luck. Now imagine doing that without a parachute, knowing that if the plane catches fire, you cannot escape. You will ride it down, you will burn. And you do this not once, but 800 times, night after night after night. One pilot's account survives. Her name was Marina Raskova, not Nadezhda, different woman, same impossible story. The bottom of her cockpit was blown away, completely gone. She could see the ground through the hole where the floor had been. 3,000 feet of empty air beneath her boots. Her legs were shredded, blood everywhere. She could not feel her feet, could not tell if they were still attached to her body. German searchlights locked onto her. The damaged Potu was lit up like a stage. Every anti-aircraft gunner within range could see her. More flak came up. Tracers, explosive rounds. Her navigator was screaming. The engine was on fire. Flames were coming through the firewall. The heat was intense. The controls were barely responding. She should have been dead already. But ahead, in the distance, she saw something, a tiny sparkle. The airfield floodlight. Their own base, maybe 15 kilometers away. Maybe more. She aimed for it, kept the nose level. Did not think about the blood or the pain or the fire or the fact that she could see the ground through the floor of her cockpit, just flew, one hand on the stick, one hand on the throttle, eyes on that distant light. The Germans kept firing, she kept flying. The navigator was still screaming. The flames were getting worse. The engine was going to seize any second. The whole aircraft was going to come apart. But that light was getting closer, closer. She could see the airfield now, see the trees around it, see the runway, see the people on the ground starting to realize something was wrong. She made it back, somehow. The aircraft was on fire, the engine was destroying itself. The controls were barely functional, but she made it back, dropped toward the runway, too fast, too steep, but she got it down. The landing gear collapsed on impact. The aircraft skidded, pieces breaking off, sparks flying. Came to rest finally in a cloud of dust and smoke. Raskova and her navigator climbed out, walked to the aid station, sat down on a bench, waited their turn for the surgeon. Other crews were being treated, flesh wounds, burns, frostbite. The surgeon would get to them when he could. Raskova sat there with her legs torn apart and blood soaking through her flight suit and waited. When they asked her afterward how she had done it, she said she did not remember. She remembered seeing the light and flying toward it. The rest was blank. The mind protects itself in strange ways. That happened. That is a real story. A woman flew a burning aircraft with half her cockpit blown away and no floor beneath her feet and made it home. That is what the night witches did. That is who they were. That was normal for them. Another mission, another near-death experience, another day at work. You cannot fly 800 missions into enemy fire without it changing you. You cannot watch your friends die night after night without it leaving scars. Some of the women developed what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder, nightmares, inability to sleep, panic at sudden noises, difficulty trusting that they were safe even when they were on the ground far from combat. But there was no treatment for that, no counseling, no therapy, no recognition that what they were experiencing was a normal human response to sustained trauma. They were expected to fly. So they flew. If you showed weakness, you were removed from flight status. If you were removed from flight status, you let down your crew, your regiment, your country, so you did not show weakness. You kept it inside. You dealt with it yourself. You climbed into the cockpit and did your job. Some of them found ways to cope, small rituals before each mission, lucky charms, prayers, though religion was officially discouraged in the Soviet system. Some wrote letters they never sent, words for families they might never see again. Some kept diaries, small notebooks hidden in their flight suits, recording what they saw, what they felt, what they feared. Most of those diaries were lost, burned with the women who wrote them, or destroyed deliberately after the war when the women wanted to forget. The exhaustion was beyond description. Flying 10 missions a night meant 10 hours in the air, 10 takeoffs and landings, 10 times calculating bomb release points, 10 times dodging searchlights and flak, 10 times restarting a cold engine after cutting it over the target, 10 times navigating back to base in total darkness with no instruments, and then landing, refueling, rearming, and doing it again for hours until dawn, then trying to sleep during the day while German bombers attacked, then waking up and doing it all over again. One navigator, Rufina Gasheva, flew 848 combat missions during the war, 848 nights of this. 848 times she climbed into the rear cockpit of a Po-2 and trusted that her pilot would bring them home. 848 times she calculated release points and watched bombs fall away into darkness. She survived. She was awarded Hero of the Soviet Union. After the war, someone asked her how she did it, how she found the courage. She said courage had nothing to do with it. You just did what needed to be done, one mission at a time, one night at a time. You did not think about the 800th mission when you were on the first. You just flew. Natalia Meklin flew 980 combat missions. 980. She started as a navigator, retrained as a pilot partway through the war, flew as both. She bore the Guards flag when the regiment received that designation, stood at attention while the flag was presented, representing all of them, all the women who had proven themselves in combat. She lived until 2005, died at age 82, outlived the Soviet Union itself, outlived the Cold War, saw the world change in ways she could never have imagined when she was 20 years old and flying wooden biplanes against the Wehrmacht. By 1945, most of the surviving pilots had flown over 800 combat missions, 800 nights of flying into enemy fire, 800 times climbing into a wooden biplane and gliding silently toward German positions while every gun in range tried to kill them. One navigator, Irina Sabrova, flew 1,008 missions, more than any other member of the regiment. 1,008 times she climbed into the rear cockpit of a Po-2 and trusted that her pilot would bring them home. 1,008 times she calculated the bomb release point by stopwatch and map. 1,008 times she survived. 23 members of the regiment were awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union. It was the highest honor the Soviet Union could grant, a Gold Star Medal, reserved for acts of exceptional courage in combat. 23 women earned it flying slow biplanes against the most powerful military in Europe. Many more received the Order of the Red Banner, Orders of the Red Star, medals for courage. The 588th became the most highly decorated female unit in the entire Soviet Air Force. The recognition came at a cost. The Soviet system did not make heroes lightly. To receive those medals, the women had to prove themselves over and over again. They had to fly more missions than the men, take more risks, suffer higher casualties. And even then, some in the Soviet military establishment questioned whether they deserved their honors. After all, they only flew training planes, they only carried small bombs. The women did not respond to those questions. They did not need to. The numbers spoke for themselves: 23,000 missions, 3,000 tons of bombs, 32 dead. The missions continued until the final day of the war. The last Night Witch sortie was flown on May 4, 1945, 4 days before Germany surrendered. By then, the regiment had flown from the outskirts of Moscow to the outskirts of Berlin. They had been in combat for nearly 3 years without pause, every single night, no matter the weather, no matter the losses. They had outlasted the Wehrmacht, outlasted the Luftwaffe, outlasted the Third Reich itself. When the war ended, the Soviet Union held a massive victory parade in Moscow. Every major combat unit marched through Red Square. Tanks, artillery, infantry, fighter regiments flew overhead. The whole world watched. The Night Witches were not invited. The official reason? Their planes were too slow. They would hold up the parade. The women who had flown 23,000 combat missions, who had terrorized the German army for 3 years, who had been awarded the Guards designation and dozens of Hero of the Soviet Union medals, were told their aircraft were too slow for a parade. 6 months later, the regiment was disbanded. Most of the women were released from service. Some stayed in the Air Force in non-combat roles. A few became instructors, but the regiment itself was dissolved. The Po-2 biplanes were retired or scrapped. The mechanics and armourers went back to civilian life. For decades afterward, the Night Witches were largely forgotten. The Soviet Union did not particularly want to remember that women had flown combat missions. It complicated the narrative. Women were supposed to be mothers and workers, not warriors. The veterans rarely spoke about their service. When they did, few believed them. It sounded like propaganda, like exaggeration. The records existed, the citations were real. But the story seemed too incredible to be true. It was true, every word of it. Marina Raskova, the woman who had created the regiment, did not live to see the victory. She died on January 4, 1943. She was leading her regiment on a transfer flight. The weather closed in. Visibility dropped to 0. Her aircraft went down in the forest. She was given the first state funeral of World War II. Her ashes were buried in the Kremlin wall. She was 31 years old. The women she had trained would fly on without her for 2 more years. Major Yevdokia Bershanskaya, who commanded the 518th through the entire war, survived. She was the only woman to receive the Order of Suvorov, one of the highest Soviet military decorations. After the war, she remained in the Air Force. She married, had a family, lived a quiet life. She died in 1982 at the age of 69. Her wartime service was barely mentioned in her obituary. Nadezhda Popova, one of the most famous Night Witches, was shot down and crashed in the Caucasus in August 1942. She and her navigator survived. They were rescued by a retreating Soviet infantry unit. There she met another downed pilot, a man named Semyon Kharlamov. They fell in love in the middle of a war zone. Both returned to flying. Both received the Hero of the Soviet Union Medal in 1945. They married after the war. Kharlamov died in 1990. Popova lived until 2013. She was 91 years old. In her later years, she would sometimes look up at the night sky and wonder how she had survived, how any of them had survived. 18 missions in one night, wooden planes held together with glue and prayers, German fighters and flak and searchlights, the cold and the fear and the exhaustion. She did not have an answer. None of them did. They had simply done what needed to be done. The Po-2 biplane would outlive the regiment by decades. The design was so successful that production continued until 1953. Over 30,000 were built. Some estimates put the number closer to 40,000. It became the most produced biplane in aviation history. After the war, the aircraft served in agriculture, as air ambulances, as trainers. Poland built licensed copies until 1959. The plane saw combat again in the Korean War. North Korean forces used Po-2s for night harassment missions against United Nations troops. They faced the same problems the Germans had. The wooden biplanes were too slow to engage with jet fighters. An F-94 Starfire, an American jet, was lost trying to intercept a Po-2. The jet slowed down to engage and fell below its stall speed. The pilot ejected. The biplane flew away. It remains the only confirmed kill of a jet aircraft by a biplane in history. The night witches proved something that should not have needed proving, that courage has no gender, that skill has no gender, that determination and intelligence and the will to fight for your home are human qualities, not male qualities. They proved it by climbing into obsolete aircraft night after night and flying into gunfire. They proved it by enduring conditions that would have broken most soldiers. They proved it by completing their missions when the odds said they should all be dead. They also proved something darker. That war will use anyone willing to be used. The Soviet Union needed pilots, needed bombers, needed every person who could hold a weapon or fly an aircraft or keep a truck running, used women, put them in combat, gave them the worst equipment, sent them on the most dangerous missions, and when the war was over, sent them home and tried to forget they had ever existed. The night witches were heroes, but they were heroes in a system that did not want female heroes, so they were honored and then quietly set aside. But the mission record remains, 23,000 combat sorties. Every one of them flown at night, in darkness, over enemy territory, in aircraft that should never have been used for combat. Every one of them a testament to what humans can achieve when they refuse to accept that something is impossible. The Germans thought they were safe at night, thought their air defenses were impenetrable, thought that slow biplanes were no threat. They were wrong. The night witches taught them otherwise. One mission at a time, one bomb at a time, one silent glide through the darkness at a time. The sound of a witch's broom sweeping through the night sky. That is what the Germans heard. What they should have heard was the sound of inevitability, the sound of women who had been told they could not fight, deciding that they would fight anyway. The sound of obsolete aircraft turned into weapons of terror through nothing but skill and determination. The sound of the Red Army refusing to break, no matter how many times the Wehrmacht said they were beaten. That sound haunted German soldiers from the Caucasus to Berlin. It kept them awake, kept them afraid, and in the end helped bury the Third Reich. The night witches flew because their country was being destroyed, because their homes were burning, because their families were dying, because someone had to fight and they were willing to do it. They did not ask for permission. They did not wait to be given the tools they needed. They took what they were offered, turned it into a weapon, and used it with devastating effectiveness. They were not given heroes' welcomes when they came home. They were not remembered by their own country for decades. But they fought anyway. And they won. In the end, that is the story. Not the aircraft, not the tactics, not the medals. The story is that when the world was burning, when the choice was between fighting in impossible conditions or watching everything they loved be destroyed, they chose to fight, in wooden biplanes with canvas wings, in freezing cold and burning heat, against an enemy that had conquered most of Europe. They chose to fight, and the enemy learned to fear the sound of their approach. The night witches flew from 1942 to 1945. 32 of them died, the rest came home, some were remembered, most were forgotten. But on 23,000 nights, German soldiers on the Eastern Front heard a soft whistling in the darkness, and they knew what was coming. They knew that somewhere above them, invisible in the night, a woman was cutting her engine and gliding silently toward them. They knew that bombs were about to fall, and they knew there was nothing they could do to stop it. That sound, that terrible soft whistling of wind through wooden struts and canvas fabric, that was the sound of the night witches, the sound of women the world said could not fight, teaching the most powerful army in Europe what terror really means. The night belonged to them, and the Germans never forgot it.